Okay, so now we have to discuss the people who are actually coming across the Atlantic and, encountering the New World, quote unquote, discovering it and eventually settling it and colonizing it. Okay, namely the Europeans. And by the way, this slide before you is a depiction of really the old world, but really the entire world as conceived, from anyone who resided in the New World before contact with the other side of the world, the Americas, right? This is how they imagined the world. This is at least one map maker's imagination of how the world was laid out, right? You may have heard that some people believed that the earth was flat back then. I would say most uneducated persons thought that. If you were educated, which is a very narrow slice of the population back then, but if you were educated or if you were, an explorer like Columbus, you believed the world was round, but the vast majority believed it was flat, kind of like this we're seeing, right? Europe, Africa, and Asia. That was the extent of the entire world. So you can see how much of an impact a discovery is going to make on, the European mindset. The fact that there's this other half the world across the way. And we'll talk more about that in a few moments. But what about these people who are traversing the Atlantic? Well, the colonizers were coming from one particular region of the old world, Europe. And this was a period in European history, specifically European history, okay, that now historians call the early modern period, the period of early modern Europe. Okay, now, if I had the advantage of some kind of, marker board, I could kind of delineate or sketch out, a timeline historically of European history, right? But it would begin with, I mentioned this earlier, the time of antiquity, moving forward to the feudal era, or what's also called um, the Middle Ages, right? Also called the medieval period. And furthermore, called the Dark Period, okay? The Dark Ages has all these different names. But roughly, this is the period with the fall of the Roman Empire lasting until roughly mid 1400s, okay? And this is the era that you may be aware of if you, watch a lot of TV shows on Netflix or HBO where they have kings and lords and oaths, loyalty oaths and knights and all this stuff, right? This is their culture, their civilization, their worldview. And at the time of Columbus, however, Europe is starting to leave behind this era of their history, the medieval period, and enter the modern period. But it's not yet entirely modern. Okay, history never happens, rarely happens very suddenly, right? It happens at a very, it happens in slow motion, right? So upon Europe entering or leaving behind actually the medieval period, entering the modern period, it happens slowly. And when Columbus is making contact with the New World, it's kind of in this cusp between both worlds. That is to say, the medieval world and the modern period. Okay. Um, and in fact, during the early modern period, that is to say, the late 1400s, by the way, the early modern period lasts roughly 200, 250 years. Again, this is a rough designation, but let's say 1450 to 1800s. Okay. This period, as it emerged from the medieval era or the Dark Ages, was in many ways, Europe that is, was in many ways more backwards and more behind the other parts of the old world. Okay. Especially Asia. I should mention this that Asia was the wealthiest part of the known world back there when Columbus and other explorers were going around trying to find their riches, right? You had this great empire over here, known as the Ming Empire during this era of 1400s. You also had a great empire happening in India, okay? And again, there were the wealthiest parts. Even the Islamic period, which we call the Middle East today, you had a lot of wealth through the Islamic trade system, and parts of Africa, okay, was very rich in terms of raw materials, specifically gold. Okay, there was a famous story of this African king who went to make, he was Muslim, and he went to make a pilgrimage to the holy city, right? And wherever he went, he just gave away gold to the point where, it caused a bit of an economic crisis. So much gold was flowing wherever he passed, right? Um, and we'll talk about, by the way, the gold coming in from the old world, excuse me, the new world to the old world, specifically the Spain, once they discovered gold in the Americas. That's going to cause this inflation crisis, right? Because so much gold was coming in the European and circulating in the European economic system. Anyway, yeah, there's all this wealth here. Europe, in comparative terms, I'm not saying that was completely poor, but it definitely was behind Asia, particularly. Okay, and in fact, why do you think these various European empires, like the Spanish Empire, eventually the English Empire, certainly the French Empire, were trying to reach Asia, and not to mention Portugal right here, right? They're going to end up going around Africa rather than going this way, like Columbus and the Spanish. Why are they trying to get to India and China? It's because they want to forge trade relations so they can get wealthy. That's where all the wealth is. Okay. So they're even risking their lives just to undertake this voyage of discovery. Well, less discovery and more, contact with the wealth over here. And eventually it will be discovery. All right. So that's the early modern period. And you may have heard that just a little before this time, 1490s, there was this period called the Renaissance in Europe, where Europe is experiencing this cultural and intellectual rebirth. You had the beginning of science, Galileo, and so forth. Other well-known scientists that are early science history, right? And it's not readily accepted back then. In fact, the Catholic Church condemns and excommunicates those scientists, right? Those early scientists, because it's considered heretical against the doctrine of the Catholic Church. You see the beginning in Europe of early capitalism, the very first stages of capitalism, leaving behind the dominant system of feudalism. And I'll talk more about feudalism transforming to capitalism when we talk about, the colonies in the Americas. Okay, so in other words, yes, Europe is behind, but it's starting to undergo this change, right? Whereby they're developing economically, intellectually, culturally, and because of various technological innovations they're making in seafaring, their ships, they're beginning to, or they are enabled, technologically speaking, to make farther voyages, and that's going to be crucial, of course, when people like Columbus make the voyage all the way to the Americas. Okay, so again, Europe was this very small corner of the entire world back then. If we consider the entire world, really including, the Western Hemisphere of the Americas here. So it raises the question, why was it the Europeans that ended up traversing the Atlantic and not the Asians, not Africans, not the Islamic traders, right? Why the Europeans, if in fact during this time they were considered behind, right? And more backwards, comparatively speaking. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have changed the slide here. But basically, iterates and recaps what we've been talking about, right? Leaving behind the medieval period, but entering modern times, but not fully modern. It's sort of sandwiched between the medieval period and modern times. But it is experiencing rebirth, and here I pose the question: why Europe and other countries? 1 second here. Okay, I'm back here. Sorry about that. All right. So the question posed was, why did Europe, quote, discover the New World? Why wasn't the more advanced civilizations in the Old World, especially Asia? By the way, I should mention this that during this period, the Ming Dynasty in China was the most powerful and wealthiest empire, really, in the entire world. That includes, the yet discovered New World. And in fact, during the beginning period of the 1400s, they had this great fleet. Okay, that was not only sort of naval, military, but also trading fleet. I encourage you to Google this, right? The Chinese fleet, Ming Dynasty, right? And if you do, perhaps I should have included a slide just for discussion. But in any case, China's technology when it came to seafaring was so impressive, especially compared to other parts of the world, like the Islamic civilization and the European civilization. If you compare their ships, these Ming Dynasty ships from China were huge. Okay, they just eclipsed the other ships from other civilizations in the old world. And the Ming fleet ended up going to places that were unknown to many people back then. They initialized contact with traders in parts of what we call Indonesia today, the Spice Islands, right? Uh, Even the east coast of Africa, certainly parts of India. So their ships had the technology to do this. And that's in the early 1400s, the first a few decades of the 1400s. Why not the Chinese? They could have easily crossed the Atlantic back then, right? Well, just to give you a heads up, what happens is you have that emperor, the Ming emperor, dying, and he's replaced by a different Ming emperor. You have this dynastic succession, and that new Ming emperor basically wanted to change the Chinese outlook from merchant activity, which was considered, anathema, or it didn't really comport or jive with, traditional Confucianism. The new emperor wanted to return to traditional Confucianism, and furthermore, he wanted to concentrate his energies at fighting, other people, other enemies on the Chinese continent, or not the Chinese continent, but the Asian continent where China was, right? That area of Asia. So he said, forget about the fleet. Let's focus on what I want to do. And practically overnight, this great fleet disbandoned. All right. My whole point is this: they could have easily discovered the New World, so to say. Okay, and then of course, how many, decades later, you had Europe discovering the New World. So we pose this question: why the Europeans? All right. Well, for one thing, historians note that exploration here was driven by economics. Okay, by the entrepreneurial ambitions of these explorers, and those who are subsidizing their voyages. Like you probably heard that Columbus was subsidized by, the Spanish crown, Isabel, right, and Philip. So it was their thirst for wealth, really, and trade for exotic spices that weren't found in Europe, right? Plus things like, sugar, Europeans, like people today, right? Europeans became addicted to sweetness, to sugar, and sugar can only be grown in a particular tropical area, right? That's conducive for that crop, right? Sugar cane. Even precious metals like gold and silver were sought by these Europeans. Various luxury goods like some of the textiles found in India would be considered so valuable. Okay, so they're driven by this, and moreover, Europeans began to compete with each other in terms of one empire rivaling another. Okay, so it was this sort of quest for imperial greatness, right? Competitiveness, competition between empires that spurred this. And we'll talk about this. We talk about Spain versus France versus the English in the New World. Okay. All right. So, and I also mentioned this technology. Europeans made vast strides in their seafaring technology. They had improved compasses, something called the quadrant, which made your location in the middle of the sea easier, and also the astrolabe, which you used, to the same thing. The caravel, Caravel, was an improvement of the earlier ships, right, which could travel faster and go longer distances. Okay, so you had these factors, right, and the culmination of it were the initial voyages made in 1492 and afterwards. All right. Now, what's going to happen, interestingly enough, is, and I just mentioned that Europe was a small corner of the entire world, and still is today, right? It's very small. Um, why? Or let me back up. After 1492, you'll see a shift in the power dynamics of the world, specifically after 1800. Okay, Europe is going to colonize the New World, but it will take further steps in dominating other parts of the world, not just the Americas. Okay, and this is known as European colonialism. Probably heard of that, imperialism and colonialism. What's going to happen is various European empires, let's say the English Empire, is going to seek initially like colonies right in the New World, like North America and what we call Jamaica today, right? Caribbean possessions and colonies, but it'll expand beyond there. You probably heard that India, or excuse me, Europe, England eventually colonized India, right? And other parts of the world. Uh, in fact, Africa by the end of the 1800s would be divided among the various European empires. It'd be carved up, all right? France, you get Algeria. Belgium, you get the Congo region, right? England, you get here, so on and so forth. Germany, you get that, right? That's colonization. And, the culmination of this would be by the 1900s, right? The early 1900s. The entire world would be dominated in some form or fashion by the Europeans. Okay, that's amazing to think about it because it went from being behind, right, compared to the rest of the world, to being the most powerful and dominant region of the world. Okay, by the way, this is called by older historians the European miracle, right? And it brings us to a very important category that we're going to constantly harken back to in this class. And that's this notion of exceptionalism. Exceptionalism. Now, I don't have that written down, but in case you need the spelling, it's Exceptionalism. Exceptionalism. All right. Now, broadly speaking, exceptionalism refers to this notion, right, that a particular nation or empire or even people, right, or religion even, or culture, this group of people or civilization, what have you, this notion that they are somehow superior, they are exceptional compared to others, right? So, in other words, if you're arguing for American exceptionalism, which you may have heard of, bandied around here or there, that refers to this notion, this idea that America is exceptional or, superior in some aspects. Not just unique, because everyone's unique, right? Every individual is unique, but you're saying that you are actually above other people in certain respects, whether it's culture, religion, you know, um, science, power, right? Military power, you're exceptional. Morality, right? Okay, so just to apply it to Europe and the so-called European miracle, this idea that Europe went within 3 centuries from being at the bottom of the old world to the top of the entire world, right? How did that happen? Well, what we're talking about here is really European exceptionalism. Get this idea there's something about Europe that made it almost inevitable for this domination of the entire world to happen. 90% of the entire world dominated in some shape or fashion by Europe, right? Okay, so again, it emerged out of the Dark Ages to become this powerful part of the world, right? Now, historians are the ones who came up with this idea of European exceptionalism. You can imagine this, that when you had, for example, let's say the Spanish king saying, okay, I'm such a great king, I have all these colonies across the world, I want someone to write down the great deeds of, my reign as a king, right? So someone does that. King Philip did this on this year, and he conquered this, right, on that year. Same thing happening in England with the English monarchs. In fact, this is really, in the European sense, a beginning of some histories, right, that we know today, like the various dynasties in England and so forth. In any case, what's happening here is Europe, even in the 20th century, right, it's looking back over its accomplishments and going, wow, that's amazing that this happened. Why did it happen? So when they ponder this questions, that is to say, historians and intellectuals ponder the question, what is it about Europe that led to us dominating the entire world? They came up with the idea of European exceptionalism. That is to say, there's something superior about Europe, whether we're talking about our culture, right, our technology, our religion, Christianity, as if God ordained us to discover the world. And if you think that sounds silly, most people believe it back then, right? You claim this land in the name of God and King Philip, right? And you put your flag down, right, in this newly discovered place, so to speak. Okay, so that's the idea of European exceptionalism, right? That somehow Europe was exceptional, superior, and that led to Europe dominating the rest of the world. How true is this? Well, this is getting into different tangents here. We don't have enough time for this, but you could spend a lot of time debating this question. But for the most part, sure, there were some technological feats that enabled Europe to accomplish this great fact. They were superior in certain aspects. But many historians question this idea that they were ordained by history or by God, right, capital G, to conquer the rest of the world by 1900, right? Now, to think about this, and this is the last part of this PowerPoint, part 3, and we'll move on after this. I ask you to entertain this idea of different types of truths. Okay, we're getting a little philosophical here, but I want you to relate this to how historians put forth this quote truth, right? That is to say, we Europeans dominated the world, practically all of the world, by the turn of the 20th century due to our exceptionalism as European civilizations. Okay, they said this is true. So let me put forth 2 ideas of truth. Okay, number 1 is contingent truth, contingent, CONTINGENT, versus necessary truths. Okay, so I'm setting up a distinction here between contingent truths and necessary truth. What is the difference? Well, let me put it this way. Necessary truths are truths that, yes, they are true. In fact, they're both true, right? Whether it's contingent or necessary. But necessary truths are true, and it could not be otherwise. It could not be the fact that they are false. There's no way it could be false. Okay, so that's opposed to contingent truths, which, yes, it is true, but it could have been otherwise. Okay, so let me ask you a question, such as, let's say, here's the truth: all triangles have three sides. Is that a contingent truth or a necessary truth? Well, if you answered necessary, you are correct. Okay, there's no way a triangle could have four sides, or one side, or 100 sides, or two sides. It necessarily must have three sides, according to definition, right? Now, what if I pose the question? Columbus discovered the New World in 1492. Well, we just talked about this. The Chinese could have easily discovered it, so to speak. It's a contingent truth, right? It could have happened otherwise. Same applies to the truth. Europeans dominated the world due to their superiority. Is that contingent or necessary? Well, today we acknowledge it as contingent. But notice this, that whenever you couch your language in terms of superiority, you're saying it can't be otherwise. Okay? Any necessary truth, erase that for a while. Any truth that's put forth in terms of exceptionalism, if you're arguing for the case of exceptionalism, you're arguing that it had to happen no matter what, because we're simply exceptional. It could not be otherwise. To put it another way, let's say you argue that England was destined to become the most powerful English empire, right? Or excuse me, the powerful world empire, which it was by the 1800s, right? Because we were ordained by God. We were God's chosen people, right? You're saying that God chose us, the English, to be, the greatest people in the world, the greatest empire. God does not deal with contingency, right? It has to be the case that, we are superior. It could not be otherwise. Okay, so hopefully you see how various historians of the past or intellectuals of the past, when they argue that their civilization is exceptional, right? When they're saying, or when they're invoking, let's say, European exceptionalism, they're arguing that it could be otherwise, that it's a necessary truth, not a contingent one. It had to happen that way, right? And I should mention this furthermore. I think I already alluded to it. Most historians today reject ideas of exceptionalism being the cause of this or that. Okay, so here's another category that we're going to explore, right? Exceptionalism. And if you think America doesn't have interesting cases where they argue of exceptionalism, think about this. What is manifest destiny? If you know what that is from high school, right, you know that it was this belief in the 19th century dealing with westward expansion of Americans into the West that argued that we were chosen by God to settle the lands of the West. Manifest destiny. Okay, so we have cases of American exceptionalism in our history, and we may dispute that today, right? Are we really God's chosen people to get rid of the Indians, so to speak, in our way and to kill them off and just put them in reservations, the ones who survived? Did God really want that to happen? Right? Okay, so hopefully this is all clear to you, how history is really an arena of contingent events, not necessary events. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to our next slide after this.